Flight school is a very intense experiment or experience.
Yeah.
And everything I had was focused on getting through flight school. So in the process of graduating from flight school, going through all the training and learning to fly, becoming fairly efficient at it, uh, personally, I was looking forward to getting in a helicopter in the combat zone and doing whatever it was I was assigned to do.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was really, I was torn in two directions. One is leaving home, and
Mm,
the other one is going to the combat zone. And we all knew full well that it was a very dangerous place to be. But
sure.
when you're young, you're able to set all that aside. You know that bad things happen, but
Mm,
it never feels like they happen to you,
mm,
not until you get there and find out that it happens to everybody. When you go into the military, like I went into the military, I was 19 years old, and
wow.
I had no idea who I was going to be or what I was going to be. But
Yeah.
right away, the Army took away whatever identity I felt I had when I joined,
Mm,
and they replaced it with the identity of a combat helicopter pilot.
mm,
And so I went to Vietnam, and I found that it not only was what I did, it became who I was. So the identity that's formed in combat is I was a medical evacuation helicopter pilot, and I flew combat missions. And it was very satisfying work. Um, how many people ever get a chance to save a life? But we did it day after day, every day, thousands of them. And the intensity of it all, the excitement, the adrenaline, those wonderful guys on our crews, the guys that we served with and partied with and became so close to that was also part of the experience that made it hard to leave.
yeah.
There were still the wounded out there in the field. And
Mm,
during that year as a combat helicopter pilot, I'd become very good at what I did. I was a unit standardization pilot at my second unit for 6 months, responsible for training the other pilots and making sure that they were ready to assume command of a helicopter when it came their time.
yeah.
So a lot of responsibility, a lot of emotional payoff. Adrenaline is addictive,
You mentioned that in the memoir. Yeah.
and all at once. It's like it's just removed. And the feeling then is, who am I going to be? What am I going to be?
I mean, and there are two things in my mind right now. One is, I mean, you go in and you're 19. I think when you're done, you're 23.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at 23-year-olds today, from a person who's several decades moved on now, when you look at a 21, 22, 23-year-old today, do you ever look at them and say, "Are you kidding me? That's how young I was when I was
Oh,
doing Vietnam."
yes. Yeah, when my kids and my grandkids were that age, it finally was really impressed on me how young and how inexperienced and how naive I was.
Yeah.
And I look at them and I do think, how in the world did we ever survive that, any of it? The missions that we flew were extremely dangerous.
Right.
Uh, there were times when we started an approach just knowing that we weren't going to live through it and accepting the fact. When you
Wow.
get a little older and get a little common sense, you won't do that anymore. That's why we were 21 and 22 years old. And
Yeah.
why the older pilots, not all, but some of them,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
got to where they wouldn't fly missions anymore. My commanding officer in my second unit was that way. He was a second tour guy, and we thought he was an old man. He was probably 35. Well, I came back from Vietnam, and Kathy was had been in school at a junior college near where we both grew up. And so she wanted to take me back up there, which was only 50 miles away, to meet some of her college friends. So I'd only been back from Vietnam maybe 2 or 3 days. So
Wow.
we went up there to the college, and I'm looking around the student union thinking, what is wrong with these people? Don't they understand what's going on over there?
Mm,
And there's no way that I could relate to them. I couldn't talk about where I'd been or what I'd done. And Kathy wanted to be proud of me. My parents wanted to be proud of me, but it was such a shock. It was almost a violent emotional shock to come back, where literally life is going on as usual, but I did not fit into it. It was hard. It's like being an alien and going to a different planet, I guess. It's that much different.
Some veterans answer this question by saying never. What's the answer from you? And the question is, how long did it take you to settle back into civilian life before you kind of felt at home again?
I think it took years, literally years. We live out in the country now, but we lived in a little town of Graybull near here, about 1,800 people. We lived there for about 10 years. We moved out here 20 years ago, but while we lived in Graybull, I used to run actually, along the bluffs overlooking town. There's a river that flows through and a really nice trail along the bluffs. And I remember, and this was probably mid-90s, I remember looking down there at the town of Graybull, standing there and thinking, you know, I really do belong here. That was a huge realization, one of those aha moments. But I've struggled with that. I've struggled with where do I fit in and how do I belong?
Some Vietnam vets kind of, don't want to be around other vets, other vets do. What's it like for you?
I'm hungry for their company.
Yeah.
I'm one of those who seeks out other vets just to talk to them.
And if I have it right, April 1968.
Yes.
Where did you land?
I landed in Benoit.
So right outside Saigon.
Yes, that's
relatively close to Saigon. What is your very first memory of Vietnam?
Heat.
Yeah.
And the smell.
Yeah.
Plus, the airplane, which is a civilian airliner, had made kind of a tactical kind of approach into Benoit. It was very steep and very fast and very hard braking at the bottom. So we were all pretty tense. So you open the door, you really fear. You don't know what to expect.
Yeah.
The bus is sitting there. It's got wire bars on the windows to keep them from throwing a grenade or anything in. And they tell you right away that you should be watching the civilian population because you go right down to town, to the city.
Through Saigon.
Yes, to the replacement depot. Plus there were coffins waiting to be loaded.
On the plane.
Yes.
So the next question I was going to ask is, you know that you're going into a war zone, but before you actually get there, it's an abstraction. But when did the fact that you were going into a war zone stop being an abstraction, something you saw, heard, and you realized, okay, yeah, this is for real? I mean, was that the moment there when you saw the coffins and you realized?
Well, somewhat, but I think maybe a moment with a little more impact came when I received my assignment for the year. Because I had originally received orders for the 4th Infantry Division when I graduated from flight school. That was before graduation, and given a month's leave. But right when we were leaving Fort Rucker, they dropped my leave to 2 weeks and changed my assignment to unassigned. So I didn't know what I was going to be doing until I got there to the replacement company.
Yeah.
And they called out my name and I went up to get my assignment, and a lot of anxiety for that because there's just huge unknowns. Yeah. So my assignment was to the 498th Med Company. And I asked the sergeant, what is that? What do they do? And he said, they're medevac. And I said, we've understood that was to be a voluntary assignment. And he says, yeah, it is. You just volunteered. But then he also told me you could change it if you want. But I decided just to go with it. So
It's a dangerous assignment. Is that because the Red Cross on the helicopter is basically a target for the Viet Cong and the NVA?
that was probably a factor, but they knew that we were unarmed.
Mm.
And unless there was some action going on, we wouldn't be there. So when they needed us the worst was when the conditions were the most hazardous.
Yeah.
And we all knew that because the unit would be in contact, in a firefight or otherwise engaged with the enemy, and we would be going right into the middle of it.
You're right. I remember the first dead body we flew out of the field, and I looked in at his body and I thought his family still thinks he's alive. Just that recognition that what you're looking at is going to have consequences, which I'm sure play out to this day in that man's family. The memory of the family member we lost in Vietnam. Are you able to, expand on that, that first memory a bit? How long had you been in Vietnam, and how long had you been with the 498th before you had that first experience?
That was probably within the first week, because I went to the 498th and, you check in, get your room assignment, assigned to a platoon, and then go out with the unit IP, standardization pilot, and do your in-country check ride, which was a breeze. And then I received a field assignment right away. So it was within a week or 10 days. And that was one of the first missions I flew. I was a co-pilot, of course, at that time, but we picked up a guy who had been killed along with a couple patients. I don't remember exactly, but after we shut down the aircraft, and that was at a fire base called Duc Pho. It was the home of the 11th Brigade of the Marechal Division.
Yeah.
So it was a big base, but we had our own landing pad, and there was an aid station there. So after we'd unloaded the patients, we shut down and went through our normal routine. And on the way back to the tent where we stayed, the Graves registration was right next door, and I looked in there, and there's his body. He's laying on this stretcher, and it just seemed like knowledge that I shouldn't have. It seemed to be totally out of place, that I would know that he was dead. But I imagine his parents sitting around, at the dinner table, and his parents and maybe a sibling or two or three, and life going on as normal for the next few hours, and never being normal again.
Yeah. Do you remember having a feeling like this is going to be a long year? I mean, this happens really early, and you've got 11 months, 3 weeks to go. Do you remember anything like that, or even kind of a feeling like that, like, wow, I mean, this is going to be a long year?
That year did stretch out. At the beginning, it seemed like it was going to be a long time, but the experiences came so fast that you really didn't have time to do a lot of emotional processing for any of them. I went through the VA's post-traumatic stress disorder treatment, and they had asked me at the beginning of the process, it was done by video conference in 12 or 13 different sessions, but they had asked me to pick out one event that was the most painful and the most traumatic out of that year, which is very hard to do. But that one probably stood a little bit above even the worst of the rest of them, because it was a little tiny girl. She was maybe 3 years old.
Oh, gosh.
And she had been, along with some other children, had been playing in the minefield at Duc Pho. So there was an explosion, and the perimeter guards had called us, wondering if we could go look and see what had happened. So we went over there, and because they were afraid to try to get to her on the ground. It would have taken hours to pick their way across the minefield. So we saw her laying on the ground. So we hovered down. I just thought, we have to do this. So we hovered down, and couldn't land because we were afraid of tripping on a landmine.
Yeah.
And there she was on the ground, and my medic reached down from the skid and picked her up, and I could hear him crying over the noise of the helicopter, not even on the intercom. I was so upset. But then as soon as we cleared the minefield, I looked back there, and there she was, this little tiny girl laying on the stretcher, and the bones that she had, where her feet should have been, just jagged white bones.
Mm.
And it was so terrible. It's an obscenity, really, that such things should happen.
Mm.
And that's a vision that I still have just as clear as day.
Do you know if she survived?
I don't know.
Just for the sake of discussion, let's say she did. I mean, then she would be in her 50s now, right? Maybe this is a really stupid question, but suppose she did survive, and suppose somehow we found her. What do you think you'd say to her?
I'm not real sure, except I think I would go see her.
Hmm.
I don't know. I've asked myself that same question.
Hmm.
I can't really apologize because
No.
I had nothing to
You
do with
apologize at
the
all.
injury, except for I was a part of the American force that was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'd probably tell her that it was so unfair that such a thing should happen to the child. And
Yeah.
I thought maybe I would try to do something for her, maybe through our 498th organization, or, I don't know, have to see her and talk to her.
Hmm.
But I'd made up my mind that I would go if she was located.
Really, you've already concluded that in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe, now of course you are in combat, but you're not a combatant, right? You're getting guys out of combat, the wounded. But obviously you became very familiar with the enemy, the Viet Cong, the NVA. How would you describe them as an enemy?
Well, while I was there, I had very little contact with them. The Army didn't prepare us well to go there because we knew nothing about our enemy.
About
We
their
knew nothing
tactics?
about, pardon?
You didn't know anything about their tactics or anything like that, or?
We didn't know anything about their history there, how many, their history of warfare and violence, and how much they were actually willing to invest. I didn't know that, but it became obvious to me while I was there that they were very committed, and some of them, at least the NBA, were well trained and well equipped and well motivated.
Yeah.
I don't think that was so true of the VC, the local forces, but the NBA they were professional soldiers, and we weren't really taught that.
Mm.
But it became obvious.
Did you have much interaction with the ARVN forces, the South Vietnamese forces?
We supported them also.
What was your?
So we flew missions for them.
Yeah, and we have a photo. It looks like the wounded guy. I'm looking at a photo here. You have a guy. Looks like he's coming into the helo, and looking at him, he looks Vietnamese to me. I don't know if he's Viet Cong, South Vietnamese, or.
That's the one laying on the stretcher in the aid station. He was an NVA.
He was NVA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was wounded, and he was taken prisoner. We picked him up. We treated the NVA and the BC wounded also. We picked them up and took them to our aid stations, and they received care.
Was that? Did it make any difference to you when you knew that in the back we've got NVA back there? It's not friendlies. It's
not really. The only difference it made in how we would prioritize our mission, because American forces received our attention first.
Sure. Yeah.
and then our allies, and then the NVA or VC. And we flew a lot of civilians also.
Well, you mentioned the little girl there,
Mhm.
and other cases. It must have struck you at the time, though, that, I mean, the U.S., I mean, with some exceptions, but, you know, as a whole, the U.S. follows the Geneva Conventions, right? Whereas the enemy does not. That Red Cross becomes a target, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it must have struck you as ironic sometimes, or just bizarre, that, you know, we're putting time and energy resources into saving the NVA, Viet Cong guys maybe, but, you know, if they captured us, it's going to be a completely different situation.
I think what was most bizarre about that was
Yeah.
that we were not allowed to be armed. We had no door gunners. That was one of those things that, as a pilot at that time in the dust off unit, you just kind of accepted it. That's how it was, you know. And
Yeah.
I think we were okay with honoring the Geneva Convention, but felt like if we got shot at, we needed to be better equipped. The first Cav did have gunners in their medevac helicopters, but we weren't, you know, we had different rules.
Okay.
We could still get support when we
Yeah.
needed it, most of the
Yeah.
time. But, you know, on the other hand, we weren't equipped with guns so we could shoot back, but we could get a pair of gunships or Cobras
To
that
come
would
in.
put out 6,000 rounds a minute,
Sure.
and that was okay.
You're doing some work with the South Koreans. How would you characterize the South Korean forces there?
They were very tough, very disciplined, very motivated, and they were ruthless. They were responsible for the security at the first place that I was stationed, Lane Field, where the 498th was.
Yeah.
Second Arvin Division, that was also their home, their headquarters, their base.
Yeah.
And they were responsible for perimeter security. So their rule is, if anybody shoots at us from the village, we go out there and kill everybody. And during that 6 months I was there, not so much as one round or one mortar was ever fired on Lane Field, just because of the Koreans. We took out wounded, and we took them back to the hospital, and then it wasn't but 15 or 20 minutes later, we got a call back to the same location for the same people. And whoever we were talking to on the ground, South Korean, had at least some English. And so the other pilot said, "Oh, they must have got something like, they must have got hurt really fast." And the South Korean says, "No, they get dead very fast." I don't think there's anybody that really condoned that I knew, but it's kind of accepted along with a lot of other bizarre things, is that's the way it was.
How about our South Vietnamese ally? How would you characterize
Well,
that?
you know, they've gotten a really bad reputation, and there were those units that were really bad. They were poorly motivated and poorly led, but not all of them. So it just kind of depended on the unit itself and on their commanders. I
Yeah.
remember picking up some Arvins one day out in the Bong Son Plain, which was a really hot area all the time. And we unloaded our patients, and the crew chief says, he called on the intercom and he said, "I had to hit that one guy with my M16. And he picked up your camera off the back of the seat."
As if he was going to take it.
He was trying to steal my camera.
Oh, yeah.
And then the other thing that had happened from time to time, and I personally had this happen, is when we would go in for their wounded, there were people who would get on the helicopter that weren't wounded, and we couldn't get them off. They just wanted to leave.
These were South Vietnamese forces.
Yes.
Did you ever wonder, you know, how is it that you say the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA especially, tenacious, persevering? I don't think anybody can dispute that. Incredibly tenacious and persevering. Viet Cong maybe a little more of a mixed bag. But did it ever did it ever, I mean, did you ever wonder about that? How is it that these guys from the North are so dogged and persevering, whereas as a lot of our allies from the South are not at all? I mean, you know, it's the same, it's the same people, right? Just, you know,
Hmm.
North Vietnam, South Vietnam. Did you ever wonder about that? Like, how
Oh,
does,
absolutely. I think that was my own, I guess, my first insight that things were not going well is when we began to come across those units that wouldn't fight, those armies that wouldn't fight.
mm,
And you'd think, you know, if their people and their government were effective in supporting them, they would be willing to invest more into the war effort. So what does that say? You know, that the war effort isn't approved by the people. You know, the people aren't behind it.
how long would you say you were in Vietnam before that kind of thinking began to run through your mind? Like, you know, I'm not sure that people here are really, I'm not sure that people who actually live here are really into this project.
Probably by the 6 month period anyway.
Yeah. And at that point, the war becomes what? About survival, of course, getting back to Kathy, but also about just what? I mean, you know, obviously saving lives, doing your best, right?
It's all about that guy on the ground that's depending on you to come for him. The mission count that I flew was over 1,100, 1,120 something.
So that must be quite a feeling when you sort of think about your time in the war, the particular role you played, and realizing that, because I mean, in these 1,100, you know, 1,100 and 20 missions, I imagine most of the time, certainly a lot of time, you've got more than one wounded guy on the helo, right?
Mhm, mhm.
So let's just say there are, I mean, has this thought ever crossed your mind that, let's say, you know, just to kind of make up a number, there are 2,000 guys walking around the United States right now who are alive thanks in part to you?
You know, both of my units that I was in also kept track of the number of patients, and it was around 2,300 that I flew.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I've thought about that a lot, and so have the other guys that I know from my unit, from both of them, that there's people walking around who wouldn't be here, and they have children and grandchildren who wouldn't be here either.
That's right.
And to know that really is payment enough for the job. I used to fly for the Forest Service on force contracts. Actually, I flew for a private operator, and a good deal of our work was to fly on forest fires. So one day in Northern California, we were moving the firefighters off the hill, changing the shift up there. And this one guy gets in the front seat of the helicopter and he picks up my extra headset and he says, "Hey man," he said, "did you fly in Vietnam?" And this was in 1987 or 8. And
Yeah.
I wasn't real sure where this was going because you just never knew about something like that.
Yeah.
So I said, "Yeah, I did. Why?" And he says, "What did you do?" I said, "I flew medevac, dust off." And he burst into tears.
Mm,
And he says, "Thank you, man." He says, "You saved our ass."
yeah.
And
That's
I
right.
could hardly see to even land the helicopter after that, because that was the first time anybody ever said thanks.
Wow.
Probably wasn't me that flew him, but it was one of our helicopters.
You mentioned Al Cherone. I think his actual first name was Norman. You told me
Mhm,
before we started recording he's from Chicago, so you called him Al. But
mhm.
what can you tell us about Al Cherone?
Well, he and I were kind of unlikely friends. I was from a ranch in northern Wyoming, and he grew up on the south side of Chicago.
Mm,
But he was a great guy, and he taught me to play pool while we were in basic training. I didn't know anything about it, and I never got good, but he was extremely good.
mm,
So we went through basic training, we went through flight school, we graduated together, And then we separated. And then 4 months later, I read the news in the Army Times, and he's been killed. His helicopter went down.
Bobby Lehman?
Yeah.
Tell us about Bobby.
Well, Bobby was, he was one of our co-pilots in my second unit, the 54th Med in July. And I spent a lot of time with him the last month or 6 weeks I was there, because I was training him to take over my my aircraft commander position. And he also took my number, my old call sign, when I left. And then he was shot down probably about a month or 6 weeks after I left. He got caught in a crossfire of 250 caliber machine guns and had a main rotor separation in flight, and the aircraft crashed and burned.
Yeah.
Everybody on board was killed.
Yeah.
I've been in contact with his family, because his death was one that just weighed really heavy on me.
Well, you mentioned in your memoir that you had had a dispute, I think, about a certain sort of tactic, and that hadn't, and the feelings of that hadn't really been resolved.
Yeah, it was never resolved. He didn't like the way I flew my approaches, which the way I had been taught in the 498 to be low and fast and come in. It scared him. And so he was more fond of the flight school type approach, was a circling, which I did not like. I felt like we were just exposed for too long. I like to find cover and go in fast undercover, like down a gully between trees. And I don't know that that's what happened the day he was killed, but I always felt like, this nagging thought that maybe I should have taught him something different. Maybe I should have taught him something better. I don't know. No, just all questions, no answers.
A good friend was shot in the seat beside me when we were ambushed on a night extraction. I was hit in the leg. Another of the crew was shot through the shoulder. How long were you out of action as a result of being hit in the leg?
That was my last mission in country. That was my last mission. I was very, very close to going home.
Wow.
And the major, actually, would have been appropriate according to the unit standard procedure for me to not be flying. And the major scheduled me to fly the next day, or the two or 3 days after, whatever. And I said, no, I didn't want to. And he was insistent. So I went to the flight surgeon, and who was a friend of mine. I said, I've done my part. I'm going to go home. So ground me. So he did.
So this is okay. So this is after you were hit in the leg.
Yes.
Okay. So it sounds like it wasn't a serious wound. Yeah.
No, just a flesh wound in the leg. Phil almost bled to death.
Wow.
He was in the right seat. He was in the left seat, which I usually flew, but the weather had kind of deteriorated, and it was in the middle of the night. Primary weather instruments are in the right seat in the UH-1, so I changed seats with him, and on the very next mission, he took a round sitting where I was before.
Oh, yeah.
And it hit him right dead center of his right elbow and severed the artery.
Oh, wow.
And so I started to pick up out of the LZ, and that was when I got hit in the leg. We were probably just a few feet off the ground, and so my left foot came off the pedal, and we actually spun, I don't know how many, once probably. And of course, it was pitch dark, and I'd shut all the lights off, no lights at all.
Wow.
So Phil came on the intercom, and he says, I'm hit. I think I'm hit pretty bad. So I had I turned the overhead light on, and he's bleeding all over the place. So and there's a picture that I sent you of that helicopter the next day. It's the one with the blood on the floor. So anyway, the crew got the bleeding stopped, and Phil was evac'd after that. He went to Japan and then home.
Wow.
And as a little side note to that story, I kept my map case in the slid down alongside of the console. 20 years later, I opened that map case and it still got dried blood in it from Phil's arm. That was a bit of a shock.
When you found that map case, you pulled it out, and it had the dried blood on it. I'm guessing you kind of froze in place for a minute, and your mind went.
Well, it was kind of a sick feeling because the feelings of that night came back momentarily.